All right, so as we have been talking, the Ottoman Empire not going through great times. They are in decline. They're kind of being, you know, to some degree taken advantage of by Europe. They borrowed more money than they could get. And so they're in debt to European powers. They're trying to westernize, trying to copy Western culture. They experience something humiliating called extraterritoriality. This is where, number one, white Europeans can move to the Ottoman Empire in like these white European only neighborhoods. And number two, white Europeans are not even able to be like arrested while living in the Ottoman Empire. They're kind of like free to do their own things. And then we mentioned that the balance of trade is off. White Europeans are not really looking to buy stuff for the Ottomans. This is not a good situation. So on our handout, we're now on the backside where it says the 1860s to the 1870s. They get a constitution, or there's a desire for a constitution. It says there was a desire to set up you'll write down a modern constitution. So they're really looking to Europe, and we want to get these all done. We're going to collect this, give you a daily grade, and turn it back in. So make sure we're keeping up here. So they want a modern constitution. They're looking to the West for a modern constitution. And in this constitution, Muslims would no longer have exclusive political power. So what I mean by that is they wanted a constitution that would change the way the government was, because even though this empire is a majority Muslim, they weren't all Muslim. In fact, there was a lot of Jews in the empire that didn't get any power. There was a lot of Christians that lived in the empire, and they didn't get any power. So it says on the handout that on the next line, or that next blank where it says Muslims no longer have exclusive political power, we want to write down one of the changes is that non-Muslims, on your handout, non-Muslims would vote. So the Jews of the empire could have a say. The Christians of the empire could have a say. So we have Jews and Christians now being able to vote. Non-Muslims would vote. The problem about these and when I say non-Muslims, I mean men, because we're not letting women vote. Like even in the United States, theoretically, the Constitution, the Declaration says all men are created equal, which is like what it says, but what two groups are left out of democracy in the United States? And women. Like, even though Thomas Jefferson did write all men are created equal, women can't vote, even if they're white women. Even if they're white. What's that? Only white. Actually, at first, it was even stronger. It was only white property owning men. And then they got rid of the property requirement. It was all white men. And so the thing is, like, even though Jefferson argues for equality, that we're born equal, there's a contradiction in American society, because white women who are wealthy and educated, maybe you're smarter than your husband, you can't vote. And then, of course, black individuals could not vote in the United States. Here, they give the expansion of vote to Jews and Christians, but just to the men. But many were suspicious on the handout of how, you'll write down, non-Muslims in the empire were becoming powerful. They were suspicious of how non-Muslims in the empire were becoming powerful. They thought, you know what, I think the Jews might have too much power, or the Christians are getting too much power. And the same thing happened in our country. After the Civil War, black men could vote, but people were like afraid, like, oh, black people can vote, terrible things are going to happen now. And so that's why they instituted, ultimately, Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow means laws that are designed to suppress black voices. And so people, in the same way, were kind of worried about these non-Muslims becoming too powerful. It says, eventually, European cultural and political wins there was in 1877, a Western-style constitution is passed. So that's cool. They get a constitution. But not everyone agrees that copying Europe is like the best thing. In fact, there's a group of people you should know called the Young Turks. This was a nationalist movement, and it says on the handout they began to question European influence. They began to question European influence. So this group of people called the Young Turks, they began to question European influence. Just the first one, because there's a comma there. In fact, more than just questioning European influence, who were these people? Well, on the second blank, we'll write down that they were well educated, who saw Westernization giving more benefits to Europe than the Ottomans. So these are not like illiterate people. They're not like, fanatical religious Muslims. These are well educated people. And they're looking at the situation and they're saying, gosh, I'm pretty sure this process of copying Europe is benefiting them more than it's benefiting us. And in general, they are pushing something called nationalism. Nationalism itself is a European concept. It really wasn't seen in the Muslim world at this level until this time. And they decide to really focus on nationalism and focus on what can we do that is independent of European influence. That's the Young Turks. Last thing to talk about today is the Crimean War. So it turns out there's going to be a fight between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And the thing about Russia, you might remember, last time we talked about Russia, there's something that Russia wants that could be like all the other European countries. What does Russia want that all the European countries have? Access to water. Now, Russia has like thousands of miles of coast, but what's the problem with their coastline? It's frozen. So they decide, you know what, we would really, really like some warm water. And it turns out when they look at the neighborhood, the Ottoman Empire is their neighbor, and the Ottoman Empire has this body of water here called the Black Sea. And Russia says, wouldn't it be cool if we took advantage of the fact the Ottoman Empire is falling apart and take over the Black Sea so we can have access to the Mediterranean Sea, because you can actually get through here, and then we can be on our way. So that's the goal, that's the plan. And you should actually remember there was one Russian leader we've mentioned by name, and his desire was to modernize Russia and to make it better. His name was Peter the Great, and he's the guy we're going to write down on the line. Russia versus a weakened Ottoman Empire. You'll write down Peter the Great tried to establish a warm water port. Peter the Great. He was the leader of Russia. He tried to establish a warm water port, and in pursuing this, they began to push southward. And there's parts on this map they actually took over. Right here, this is a part of the world, I don't know if you can see it from where you're at, but this is called Georgia. It's kind of confusing sometimes because that's like a state in our country, but that's also a country. And they also take over Georgia. We'll write that down on the line. They actually took parts. They took parts of the Ottoman Empire, including this part right here, which is Georgia. They took parts from the Ottoman Empire. Again, on the handout, it says, in this fighting, this Crimean War was in around the Black Sea, and this war was fought around this region, and they gained, we'll write down, territory. They gained territory. In fact, that's why I mentioned Georgia. They gained Georgia, this territory here. They got land, and also areas called the Caucasus, which is like there's this mountain range here. So they got land out of the war, but their real goal isn't to like get Georgia, even though that's cool. They really want to get the Black Sea. And so we're going to write down that there's two sides to this war. And if you look at this next line, it's called alliances, and there's like the longest line ever, because it turns out there's like a lot of countries that are going to team up to fight against Russia. So in fact, there's 5 countries, so we need to make sure you can fit 5 countries. I try to give you a long line. The 5 countries that are going to hook up against Russia, well, number 1 is Austria. So there's 5 that we need to put, so make sure you write small enough. Austria, they're going to fight against Russia. We haven't really talked about Austria before. Vienna is here. This is the capital of Austria. Austria is right here. They're going to hook up with the Ottomans and fight against Russia. The second country in that really long line is Britain. Britain is going to sign up and fight against Russia. That's the second of the 5. The third country in that long line we'll write down is France. France is going to sign up to fight against Russia. Number 4, another country we haven't really talked about is Italy. Italy is going to sign up to fight against Russia. And then, of course, the last one is the Ottoman Empire versus Russia. So that's a lot of countries against Russia. We have Austria, Britain, France, Italy, Ottoman Empire, all fighting Russia. What two countries on that list are kind of weird because they don't like each other? Yeah, Britain and France don't like each other, but even though they don't like each other, they're willing to hook up and work together to fight Russia. And that's weird because why would a bunch of white European Christian countries, because Austria, Italy, France, England, they're all white European countries, why would they fight fellow white Europeans? Why would they help Muslims, a different religion, a different culture? Why would they hook up and fight against Russia? If you have 5 people tag teaming against Russia, what are people afraid of regarding Russia? They're too powerful, right? Like if you are double teaming, you're ganging up on one, they're looking at Russia with fear and with concern. It says on the handout where there is the why, you will write down the why. The why is that they feared the growing power and influence of Russia. They feared the growing power and influence of Russia. And so this war, it's going to be hard if you have 5 against 1. It's going to be really hard for you to win this war, and the Russians don't win this war. It says on the handout that the guy in charge of Russia, he's called the Tsar, and the word Tsar is funny because it can be spelled with a C, or like on the handout, how do I spell the word Tsar? With a T. Either way, it's actually still pronounced Tsar. So the Tsar, the leader of Russia, Alexander II, was hampered, it says on the handout, by a lack of railroads. A lack of railroads. Why would Russia not having railroads hurt you in your army? What are railroads going to allow you to do with your army? Yeah, and listen, the rest of the world has trains and railroads, but not Russia, because you know what? All of Europe went through a scientific revolution, but Russia did not. All of Europe went through an industrial revolution, but guess what about Russia? They did not. And so while other countries can use trains and steam power to move their soldiers around quickly, Russia's army are like walking to the battle. Like, that's not a good situation. So it was hampered by lack of rail. It says on the handout, and so there's 2 words, lack of rail and lack of industrialization. All of this, lack of industrialization, lack of rail, both of those things together hindered the amount of troop movement that was possible. We don't have an industrial revolution, and that's going to be a problem. It says on the handout that because they lost, this really discredited the government. People got tired of their government. They thought, man, our government can't do anything right. People have been demanding changes for a long time. You might remember Russia actually still had serfs. Serfs were like people tied to the land. Most of Europe got rid of serfs like in the year 1300. Russia still has them 500 years later. So Russia is like super backwards. So people were kind of upset and they're not happy. They wanted to fix the serf system, the education system. They wanted to change the military. There was a lot of reasons, it says on the handout, to dislike the government. A lot of reasons to dislike the government. So that's the Ottoman Empire. That's Russia's situation. I actually want to stop right here and conclude our last material in class next time. So that kind of brings us to a close for today.